Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento, and this is a lecture on Dan Dennett's article, Did HAL Commit Murder, from 2001 Space Odyssey, and this is from my Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence course. Okay, so we've considered a bunch of moral dilemmas, moral problems, moral issues surrounding artificial intelligence, and we just came off of looking at whether or not it's possible to rape a robot, or would it be wrong to design a robot that acted like it was being raped. So now we've got the question in front of us about whether or not artificial intelligence system could have the right sorts of properties to be guilty of murder. And this article and the movie are old. The movie's from the 60s, and Dennett writes this article in the late 90s, so it's 25 already at that point, 25 years after the movies come out. But it's a famous movie. Most people think it's one of Kubrick's best movies, and I think Kubrick's one of the best directors ever. So if you haven't seen 2001 Space Odyssey, we've already got spoiler alerts here. Hal kills one of the crew members. He kills Frank Poole, and then he tries to kill Dave Bowman. And the question is, well, what kind of killing is this? Is it a murder? Or is it something else? So let's consider some contrast cases. If you've got a worker who gets killed by a programmed robotic arm, like in a factory that just all day long moves engines into a car chassis and does it thousands of times. It just moves through a specific set of motions. It's just programmed to just move back and forth. If a worker gets injured or killed, that's not, I guess, we don't think that's a case of murder, right? Not in that kind of instance. What's missing there? Now, in this particular case, it looks like this worker might be operating the robotic arm, so that would make one kind of case. But imagine the thing is just a machine that just repetitively does this one action over and over and over again, and somebody happens to step in the way and they get crushed and killed. Okay, that's not murder. It's an accident. Somebody's dead, but it's not murder in the class in what we need. So let's consider some other contrasting cases. Dennett doesn't talk about this kind of case, and I think it's relevant to think about here. I don't know if I have all the answers we need about it, but imagine some tourist is on safari in their car. They open up the car window, they lean out to take a picture, and a lion grabs them. The lion attacks them, pulls them out, kills them, and the rest of the lions jump on top, or maybe. I don't recommend it, but maybe you're watching the Tiger King. One of those tigers gets a hold of somebody and hurts them. Is that murder? I think we don't want to categorize that morally as a murder. There's something missing in that kind of case. And legally, classically, the way we understand this about legal moral responsibility here is that what's missing is a guilty mind. So Dennett actually, I don't recommend you do this, but Dennett actually quotes from the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy. Here's our definition of what it is to have a morally culpable state of mind, or mens rea is the Latin term. A guilty mind. Such culpable mental states are of three kinds. They are either motivational states of purpose, cognitive states of belief, or the non-mental state of negligence. And we won't talk about that last case. But the idea here is, at least part of what's necessary, is the culprit must form the mental intent and have the knowledge that one's action or failure to act will lead to the death of the victim. So you've got that in mind, you're trying to do that. At least that's got to be true of somebody. Now, there might be some exonerating circumstances that make it diminish your guilt, but if you've got that intention in mind and you achieve it, then it looks, at least prima facie, we've got a case of somebody who's guilty of murder. The robot arm doesn't have a mind at all, so it can't have mental intent. The lion is just getting its dinner, I think. The lion is just doing what lions do. It doesn't operate at the level of choosing or not choosing to harm someone else. Although we do, thinking about Dennett's notion of the intentional stance, we would say about the lion that it's planning, that it's tracking, that it's devising a plan in order to catch the tourist. The lion waits and watches until the tourist leans out the window, and then it grabs it. So that seems like it's a kind of planning, and it intends to eat the tourist. So maybe on some superficial, on some level, it looks like maybe the lion's got some of what's needed, but there's something else missing there the lion doesn't have. We don't think of lions as moral agents. Maybe we don't think of them as capable of not doing that. We don't think of them as sort of recognizing that what they're doing is wrong. And certainly HAL seems to have that capacity in the movie. Okay, so did HAL commit murder then? What else would have to be true in the robot arm case? So just leave the lion aside. But if the robot arm or a machine or a computer program were to commit some action, what else would have to be true of it for it to be a murder case? Is HAL a robot with a mind, with evil intentions, that's capable of murder? Is the question we're asking. So where mens rea means to have performed a legally prohibited action, such as killing another human being, one must have done so with a culpable state of mind. And those states of mind are either, as we've said, a motivational state of purpose, and it's going to look like HAL's got that. Cognitive states of belief, it's going to look like HAL has got that. Or the non-mental states of negligence. All right, so if you don't know, I'm going to give you a little bit of, if you're not fresh on it, I'm going to give you a little bit of 2001 Space Odyssey so we can see what's going on. So what's happened at this point in the movie is that Frank Poole went out to work on something on the ship. It's called the Discovery, and HAL cut Frank Poole's airline, and Frank Poole dies, and he goes careening off into space. This guy, Dave Bowman, then goes out in a pod to recover Frank Poole's body. So Dave Bowman is trying to get back into the Discovery with Frank Poole's body.
Open the pod bay doors, please, HAL. Open the pod bay doors, please, HAL. Hello, HAL. Do you read me? Hello, HAL. Do you read me? Do you read me, HAL? Do you read me, HAL? Hello, HAL. Do you read me? Hello, HAL. Do you read me? Do you read me, HAL?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, HAL.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, HAL?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, HAL.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, HAL?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
All right, HAL. I'll go in through the emergency airlock.
Without your space helmet, Dave, we're going to find that rather difficult.
HAL, I won't argue with you anymore. Open the doors.
Dave, this conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
HAL? 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 HAL?
Okay. So, sorry for the... Let me see, I'll get this thing back open. There we go. Sorry for the interruption. All right, so there's the sort of exchange between Dave Bowman and HAL that reveals a whole bunch of the sort of nuances and the features of HAL's consciousness and his and how HAL operates that Dennett then uses to sort of explore the rest of this argument and figure out what's going on with HAL. So Dennett then starts wondering about, or starts puzzling over whether or not there might be some exculpating conditions. That is, there might be some facts, circumstances, or considerations that would absolve the defendant of guilt in this case, right? So it sure seems like HAL is deliberately, purposefully intended and tried to... Let me see, I'm going to get this thing back open. There we go. All right. So here's a possible defense. Somebody might say, and they might think, somebody might offer this idea. Well, look, robots don't have any feelings. They don't have any, they don't feel one way or another. They don't feel guilty. They don't feel any remorse. They don't have any anger or sadness or regret. So maybe that disqualifies or exculpates them from responsibility here. And Dennett's response is, look, the legal concept of mens rea and the legal concept of a guilty mind here has no requirement that the agent be capable of feeling guilt or remorse or any other emotion. So-called cold-blooded murders are even worse by most of our accounts, right? They're not in the slightest degree exculpated by the flat affective state, right? So he makes a comment about Spock here. It doesn't matter if you've got no emotions. What matters is you forming the intent, pursuing the plan, and enacting this thing with sort of an awareness of the consequences of what you're doing, and you know what you're doing to them. Okay, so that won't do it. The HAL's alleged lack of emotional affect won't do it. I think there's some evidence in the movie that HAL's got emotional states, and Dennett worries about that a bit. But so it doesn't matter in either case if HAL's actually got emotional states, then that this line of reasoning wouldn't exculpate him anyway. So what about the question of motivational states of purpose or cognitive states of belief? Does HAL intend? Is HAL trying to do this to Dave and to Frank Poole? And for reference here, what Dennett does is he goes back to the case where IBM's Deep Blue beats Kasparov playing chess. And I just lifted some language here where people describe, and where I think this is actually Dennis language for describing how it is that Deep Blue beat Kasparov. Dennett says, well, Deep Blue discovers and executes with exquisite timing a withering attack. And Deep Blue's got purposes. Deep Blue exploits a subtle flaw. Deep Blue figures out how to beat Kasparov, and so on. And you'll also find in a more modern example, and this is much later after Dennett wrote this piece we just read, but AlphaGo, of course, beat Lee Sedol at a much harder game at Go just a few years ago. And people will say things like, I think this is from the Wikipedia page, that AlphaGo had excellent strategy, making moves no human player would, played a near-perfect game, is creative. AlphaGo was unique, exquisite moves that looked like mistakes. So there's a lot of intentional language here that's being attributed to, or intentional concepts that are being attributed to Deep Blue and to AlphaGo. And that's going to be very important for Dennett's answer about what kind of machine, what would a machine need to have in order to have mens rea? And the answer is, well, it has to be an intentional system. Now, Dennett is famous for having introduced this idea of what he calls the intentional stance. And his idea is that if an artifact, if a machine, if an animal, if its behavior is predictable and explainable by our attributing to it beliefs, desires, cognitive states, motivational states, goals, purposes, and the rationally required and it's rationally required to figure out what it ought to do in light of all its beliefs and desires, then it's an intentional system. That is, you see something like a squirrel and you go, well, why is the squirrel burying those nuts? Well, he's trying to save up food for winter. So the squirrel's got a purpose. So it's a sort of intentional system. And as systems get more and more complicated, more complex, then you have to use more and more purposeful, intentional language in order to successfully describe what they're doing. And descriptions at other levels won't work as well or won't work at all. Like to describe what HAL's doing at the molecular level won't help us much, or at the chemical level or at the programming level, it doesn't help us much. It might inform us some, but there's a kind of streamlined, easy, clear, manifest way to explain what HAL's doing. Oh, HAL believes that Frank Poole and Dave Bowman are going to unplug him. And HAL doesn't want them to stop or doesn't want them to unplug him or to kill him, so he's going to stop them. Right? And it's very easy and very obvious to attribute those kinds of states to HAL in this kind of case. I mean, look, we were even doing it with a chess program in the 90s. So if you said about Deep Blue that Deep Blue is trying to divert Kasparov's attention to this side of the board, or if Deep Blue is trying to compromise Kasparov's defenses, you're already using intentional language to describe something, that's 40 years out of date computationally in terms of computer science, developments. So if we can use it then to talk about that machine, then surely, ironically, the movies about this book it was movies made in the 60s, and it was supposed to all happen in 2001, right? Here we are in 2020, where we don't have any systems nearly as sophisticated as HAL. So maybe, imagine another 100 years out. Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick were off the mark on how soon we get to these levels. But hey, that's one of the risks you run in science fiction, right? Okay, so do Deep Blue and AlphaGo have enough intentionality to be murderers? And Dennett's answer is no, although the idea that AlphaGo made moves that look like mistakes, possibly to divert Sadal, is very suggestive of deceit, theory of mind, awareness of its own beliefs, and so on. So some people kind of talk about AlphaGo as if it was deceiving Sadal or making some moves that look like mistakes as a kind of subterfuge to beat Sadal. I don't know that that's really what happened. That was just the humans kind of anthropomorphizing there. So we do need to be aware of and conscious of the difference between using intentional language that helps us make successful predictions about a system's behavior and our just anthropomorphizing, right? And we know that we're highly prone to over attribute lots of these very properties to systems. You just put eyes on a robot and people will attribute emotional states to it, and so on. So we're prone to have high false positives on this vector. But Dennett says, keep that under control and just imagine that we've got a system that is well described and well predicted by using intentional language. That's an intentional system. But now the question is, what do we need to add to something like Deep Blue to make it, sophisticated enough or complex enough to have more of what it would take to be guilty of murder? And Dennett's answer is richer sources of perceptual input, like HAL's world or the system's world needs to be much richer than just a chessboard. It has to perceive more of the world than that. It has to have the means of coping with the barrage of information that's going to come from all these perceptions in real time, the capacity to make good enough decisions. That is, you have to sort of make decisions about your priorities and about how much computational time and energy you have to dedicate to this task versus that task. Given time constraints, it's going to have extra layers of control above and below its chess playing software, traffic control policies in its operating system. So this is Dennett, in the 90s, speculating about some of the add-ons that you would need in order to expand a system like Deep Blue to get it up to this level of being a more expanded intentional system. And then furthermore, it's going to have to monitor its own expanded resources, streamline, eliminate inefficient habits of thought, eliminate dead ends. It's got to sort of recognize or monitor itself in some way in order to sort of plan and think and go on and so on. And I've added this comment, this notion of theory of mind. Dennett doesn't say this, but look, it's got to have, in effect, what we've been calling theory of mind in our AI class. It has to have beliefs about its own beliefs, desires about its desires, beliefs about its fears and about its thoughts and about its hopes and so on. This is metacognition, as we've been talking about in our AI course. So what Dennett's saying here is, deep mind is just a cognitive system. It's not a metacognitive system. Deep blue. Arguably, AlphaGo has got some meta level processing. There's two systems at work in AlphaGo. One is evaluating the outputs of the other system and sort of monitoring and keeping track of it. So Dennett hints at this notion of recursion or metacognition, that when you're thinking about you, or I'm thinking about your mind and the contents of your mind, then that's some of what you need to add to these systems to get them up to speed, to get them closer to this notion of being fully guilty at that level. Okay, so if I believe that I believe today is Wednesday, okay, so it's not just I believe today's Wednesday, but I realize, oh, that's a thing that I believe. Okay, that's a belief about the states of my own systems. That's a metacognitive belief. And by extension, I can have this about you. I can form the belief that you believe that 2 + 2 = 4, or that, today is Wednesday. So that's not just a first order belief about the world, but it's a belief about the contents of minds, either my mind or your mind. And that's this added layer of, and that's why I'm calling it theory of mind, this added layer of intentionality, higher order intentional systems that Dennett wants the system to have. So higher order intentionality is a necessary precondition for moral responsibility. And maybe that's what the lion that attacks the tourist lacks. And Deep Blue exhibits little sign of possessing such a capability, but HAL appears to have loads of it. HAL appears to have quite a bit of theory of mind. And this picture I've got here is of Frank and Dave are scheming inside one of the pods inside the Discovery to unplug HAL because they're worried about HAL. They think that HAL's up to something, and they try to do it where HAL can't see or hear them, or he can't hear them and understand what they're getting at. But HAL actually watches their lips through the porthole there, and then figures out what they're saying to each other. So HAL is forming a model and an awareness that Dave and Frank have ideas, they have plans, they have purposes. So HAL's got theory of mind about those guys' states. Okay, so clearly HAL is a higher order intentional agent in Dennett's sense. He responds to novelty with novel reactions, a feat that requires his memory to have an organization far beyond that required for simple conditioning to novel stimuli. This is Dennett's words, it's sort of expanding on the point. HAL has problems of resource management, not unlike our own. He has obtrusive thoughts that can get in the way of other activities. He's sometimes interrupted when he's doing one thing with other things he's got to worry about and work on. And furthermore, being able to deceive, which HAL does, requires higher order intentionality or theory of mind. And there's two kinds here. There's self-deception and other deception. And pretty clearly he deceives them in the story. HAL also has enough world and human knowledge to understand and have empathy for the human condition. He understands what it would be to end a human life, by extension on having this theory of mind. So Dennett's suggestion here is that, HAL's he's got more of the components that are needed in order to cross this line. So could there be some exculpating circumstances? Could there be some reasons that would let HAL off the hook? One of the reasons we let humans off the hook is maybe they're insane. Maybe they've lost their faculties. Maybe they're having an emotional breakdown. And HAL does say at one point when he's getting shut down, he says, "I'm afraid." But is this enough, or are the questions about HAL's emotional and mental integrity enough for diminished moral responsibility? The way that you might have a human who's got compromised sanity might have diminished moral responsibility for their actions. We talk about these a lot and we think about them a lot in movies, but it turns out that juries are very rarely convinced by insanity defenses. They very rarely will accept it and very rarely let somebody off for it. But in some cases, we do think, well, you've been compromised enough, or you're not functioning at a high enough level that you're not actually morally responsible in the normal way that you would have been for your murder. So maybe that puts them more sort of down in the lion category or something like that. So Dennett considers the possibility of brainwashing or indoctrination. And this is as close as Dennett gets to sort of the obvious question about programming, right? If the thing, I said originally about the robot arm, if it's just programmed and it crushes somebody, accidentally on the car assembly line, is that a murder? Well, is HAL programmed that way? Is HAL just is HAL's actions, are they just the outcome of executing serial lines of codes? And it doesn't look like it. The way that Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick set this up, and admittedly they were writing this in the 60s, so they're not, and neither one of them are computer scientists. Actually, Arthur C. Clarke might have been, or might have some skill here, but it's 50, no, more than 50, 60 years ago, right? So maybe, the case that comes to mind here that I think of with Dennett's example about a programmed cult member is the Patty Hearst case. So in the early 70s, there was a famous daughter of a newspaper magnate. Her name is Patty Hearst, and she gets abducted by the members of the Symbionese Liberation Army. And they subject her to this horrible torture and brainwashing for months and months. They keep her in a closet, and they subject her to all of this sort of, what we think of as brainwashing. And ultimately, nobody sees her for months and months until she shows up on a bank video camera with the members of the SLA. They're robbing the bank, and she's got a machine gun, and she's helping them rob the bank. And this is a really famous trial that everybody in the U.S. watched because the question was, well, was she guilty of helping commit the bank robbery? And ultimately, the jury didn't exonerate her. I think that they may have mitigated her time in jail some, but they actually sent her to jail and held her responsible for her actions in engaging in that bank robbery, right? So she was this sort of wealthy young daughter of, just a sort of regular mainstream American woman who gets abducted, and these people force her into a mindset where she helps them rob a bank, and the jury said, okay, you're guilty, and they sent her to jail for it. So it's very hard to get off on this kind of, to exonerate somebody on this kind of consideration. Dennett says, well, look, HAL was trained up for his mission is the only thing that gets said in the movie and gets said in the book. And then Dennett asked the question, at what point does benign responsibility enhancing training of human students become malign responsibility diminishing brainwashing? Like, at what point do you lose responsibility for your actions? Does the training shift over to something more like brainwashing? And Dennett seems to think that the programming concerns here don't really exonerate HAL. And it seems like the obvious point to make here is, the system or the machine is just programmed. And we'd have this sort of intuition that if it's merely programmed and doing what it does, then it's not guilty in a murder sense of guilty, not responsible that way. So I just want to make stress a point here that Dennett doesn't. Look, AlphaGo, for instance, I'll just point out, isn't really strictly predictable. We don't know what AlphaGo is going to do in any given game. Even AlphaGo's programmers, I hesitate to use that word a little bit, but the engineers who build AlphaGo, they don't know what AlphaGo is going to do when AlphaGo plays games. AlphaGo was trained, and then it's not exactly predictable what AlphaGo will do in any given game. We don't know what it'll do next. I mean, if Lee Sedol knew what it could do next, then it could beat him. AlphaGo's not locked in, and I think this is true, that AlphaGo wouldn't play the same game twice. I bet that's true of Deep Blue as well. DeepMind is the company that runs AlphaGo. Deep Blue is the program that IBM produced in the 80s to beat Kasparov. So I think it's true of Deep Blue and AlphaGo that they wouldn't play the same game twice, and they're responsive to what the other player is doing. It seems like in some significant philosophical sense of the term, could have done otherwise. AlphaGo could have done otherwise. It might have done otherwise in other circumstances. If Lee Sedol had done something different, then AlphaGo would have done something differently. So AlphaGo might not be free in a really robust philosophical sense, but HAL seems to be free enough in that sense. So the question of freedom, programming, this counterfactual notion of could have done otherwise, and the extent to which it bears on responsibility is obviously a question here about whether or not a machine system would be responsible for its actions in a moral sense, in a sort of guilty mind sense. And what I'm suggesting here is that, look, by any of our sort of old school go-fi intuitions about being programmed, being determined, being lockstep, serial systems, even now with AlphaGo, which is a far less sophisticated system than HAL, even now that system doesn't seem to be determined or programmed or locked in the way that we tend to think about go-fi systems, right? So we think of machines and we think of programming as having a kind of deterministic feature, deterministic character to it. And even now they don't have that. So I think in some significant sense of free, whatever we mean by free, even AlphaGo's got some of it. And certainly it looks like HAL's got enough of it to qualify, right? Or if you're going to argue that HAL's not free, then it's going to start looking like lots of humans aren't free in their decisions either, right? So in the sense of freedom we need here is just enough freedom to say that you're morally and legally responsible for your actions, not perhaps in this really even more abstract philosophical sense. Hope that makes sense. So Dennett asserts that HAL can think for himself. For example, he's capable of being moved by reasons. He's accessible to rational persuasion. Like he has this conversation and they argue. He argues back and forth with Dave Bowman. And he's receptive, or at least responsive, to the introduction of new evidence or to further considerations. So it looks like HAL has got a lot of got what's needed here in order to say he's free. Now, a lot gets made in the movie of the fact that HAL makes a mistake. That's first what calls HAL's problems to Frank and Dave's attention. That's why they're having the scheme, this conspiracy about him. And Dennett comments on it at some length, so I'm going to talk about it. Does HAL's making a mistake show that he's compromised or he's disabled? And in movies, we make a lot about it when a machine makes a mistake, as if something's really deeply wrong now. And I think Dennett's got this right. He calls this out. It's a faulty view. If a machine makes a mistake, then it must be broken somehow. That's a mistaken way to view it. That's a faulty view, and Dennett objects to it, and I think this is right. And even in the 90s when he wrote this, he had this right. Look, the point of heuristic programming, using methods that subvert the need to make impossible brute calculations of combinatorial explosions, is to take risks, is to make probability judgments, is to truncate certainty. And here's the idea. Look, when the world that the AI system is dealing with is more complicated, it's got more possible future states in it than a chessboard, the combinatorial explosion of all the possible ways the world could go from here gets too big. It gets far too big to be able to calculate it. We've called this the branching factor in class, where the branching factor for chess is like on average about 34. There's about 34 legal moves that could unfold from any particular state of the board. The branching factor for Go is something more like 200. The branching factor for the real world is, infinite. There's an infinite number of possible states that could happen next. So it's not ever possible to do brute calculations of all the possible states that might unfold from here on out. We're always using heuristics to trim down and to confine the world we think about, and to tame it according to our computational resources. So we've only got so much time and so many computations you can make per second. This is true of you and of an AI system, and there's only so much time and energy you can devote to any particular decision. So you're always making decisions that are just good enough, and those are by their nature, they're probabilistic, they're stochastic. You're making guesses about what's the most likely path of action here that will probably get me the results I want. So good decisions, including good AI decisions, good machine decisions, are always going to be making educated guesses, hopefully good probabilistic guesses about what is probably going to happen next. And those will be wrong sometimes. That's part of what it is to be making inductive, doing inductive reasoning. They will be wrong sometimes. You will make mistakes, but that doesn't make it, that's not a fault or doesn't expose some problem in the machine's operating and doing what it does. So that's another way in which our go-fi intuitions betray us when we start thinking about what a sufficiently advanced or sophisticated AI system would be like. So good decisions then aren't flawless decisions. They're optimal for time, resources, priorities, and computational capacities. And that's true of you and of AI systems. Even when you get it wrong, if you did it well, if you made the decision the right sorts of ways, then it's a good decision, even if it came out to be the unlikely or the improbable thing happens sometimes. And then you have to deal with that too. Okay, so are there other possible exculpating circumstances that would get HAL off the hook here? Maybe it's duress. That's something that we might allow, to absolve somebody of murder responsibility. Look, we're rational, and we can be faced with overwhelmingly good reasons in some cases, like self-defense, for example, for killing someone. And those can partially or wholly exonerate us. It might be that you knew that what you were going to do was going to kill somebody, and you did it on purpose, but there's overwhelmingly good reasons for doing that, namely, that person was going to kill you first. So in a court of law, if we're talking about responsibility here, we would let you off in those kinds of cases if they're sort of defined the right way, if the conditions are met. So maybe HAL is guilty of murder, but he is. We're going to let him off. We're going to exonerate him because of self-defense. And there's some evidence that something like that might be going on here. Look, Frank Poole and Dave Bowman, they're conspiring to shut HAL off. Now, it turns out that what Bowman actually ends up doing is just sort of disabling HAL, just making HAL unconscious. But maybe HAL doesn't know that. Maybe HAL, for all HAL knows, they're trying to kill him. HAL might have thought so, and the movie sort of leaves that open, although Bowman just ends up disabling him. But maybe HAL didn't know that. Maybe if you're going to be HAL's defense attorney, you argue here's where you drive your hard point home. Yeah, HAL knew what he was doing, and he was trying to kill both of them, but it was an act of self-defense. Okay, next, Dennett draws from Arthur C. Clarke's book to get this line. He had been threatened with disconnection. He would have been deprived of all of his inputs and thrown into an unimaginable state of unconsciousness. That might be grounds enough to justify HAL's course of self-defense. That might get him off here, I think, is what Dennett is suggesting. And then Dennett seems to think this helps. So furthermore, rendering him comatose at the very minimum, and certainly killing him would do it. It would jeopardize his whole mission, his whole life's project, everything he was supposed to do. HAL runs that big, the ship, the Discovery. He runs all of the systems, and his entire purpose for existence is engaging in that mission. And some of the background here is that the Discovery was originally destined to go on this exploration mission to go to Jupiter, but then the mission gets diverted by the discovery of this monolith. There's this monolith on the moon, and then there's another one out in orbit around Jupiter, and they take the Discovery, which HAL was then functioning and training up to run for the original Jupiter exploration mission, and they divert Discovery to go investigate the monolith. So HAL ends up having these two conflicting purposes. Or it may be, I'll have to look at the movie again, it might be that Bowman and Poole are intent on investigating the monolith, but HAL is intent on doing the Jupiter investigation mission. So there's these odds, there's this conflict of purposes here.
What Dennett says is, okay, you adopt the intentional stance here, and you can put yourself in Hal's place. If I believe the mission to which my life was devoted was more important in the last analysis than anything else in the world, what would I do? If I believed that, if I felt that way, then maybe I would kill those two as well. And would that exonerate my committing murder to some extent? Dennett seems to be sympathetic. So he would protect himself with all the weapons at his command, without rancor, but without pity. He would remove the source of his frustrations, and then, following the orders that had been given to him in case of the ultimate emergency, he would continue the mission unhindered and alone. Okay, so HAL pretty clearly was a higher order intentional system in the technical sense that Dennett means, and the behavior of those things can be predicted by attributing beliefs, goals, intents, and purposes to them. And furthermore, a higher order system has this theory of mind, so it has metacognition about its own states and about the mental states of others. HAL had intent. He knew what he was doing. It didn't appear that he was brainwashed or programmed, at least to the extent to which that would exonerate him. He was deceitful, and he killed Frank Poole on purpose, and he tried to kill Dave Bowman. And there's other crew members in deep sleep hibernation in the ship that HAL disconnects earlier in the movie too. I've spoiled the whole thing for you now if you haven't seen it. He may be exonerated, however, it seems to be Dennett's suggestion, by self-defense and the fact that they were destroying his whole life's work. So we might cut him a bit of slack for that.